Las Vegas in the late evening carried a sound unlike any other city in the world. A low, continuous hum made from slot machines, breathing coins. Distant laughter floating through open casino doors. Champagne glasses touching like tiny bells. And the soft echo of music drifting down neon corridors where night never truly ended. Dean Martin had walked these streets more times than he could count. Had stood beneath these lights as both a king and a servant. An icon adored by strangers and a private man. Constantly protecting the fragile circle of life he kept hidden behind the curtains of fame. To the public, he was effortless charm in a tailored suit. The smooth voice gliding over big band orchestras, the relaxed smile of a man who never seemed to carry weight. But that night, as his driver guided the car slowly along the strip, Dean stared out the window with an expression no audience had ever been allowed to see. Not amusement, not swagger, not ease, but a deep, unmoving focus, as though something cold had been placed carefully inside. His chest and left there to settle. It had started earlier that afternoon, quietly the way truly dangerous things often did. Dean had been in a rehearsal room behind the sands, the piano lid open, few musicians running a new arrangement while cigarette smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling lights. He was laughing between takes, offering small notes, adjusting phrasing. When his assistant stepped in without knocking, pale in a way that didn't belong to the warm Vegas glow. She held a folded piece of paper as if it were heavier than it looked. No one else noticed the change at first. Not the drummer tapping his sticks, not the pianist turning pages, not the stage manager murmuring into a headset, but Dean noticed immediately. Because he had spent a lifetime learning the language of people who were afraid. He excused himself with a casual gesture, closed the door, and unfolded the note. There was no dramatic language, no overt threat written in red ink, no curse words, no grand display. Just an address he recognized instantly, the small Beverly Hills street where his children lived. The time of day they returned from school, and a single sentence beneath it. Neat and unemotional. Men who forget their obligations often need reminders of what truly matters. There was no signature. There didn't need to be one. In that world, names were rarely written. They were implied. For several long seconds, Dean did nothing. He didn't curse. He didn't sit down. He didn't even exhale. He simply stood, holding the paper while somewhere behind the walls of the sands. A trumpet slid into a warm, easy phrase that belonged to a song about love and luck and laughter. His first thought was not of himself, not of his reputation, not of contracts or money or casinos, or the strange unspoken alliances that had long hovered around Las Vegas entertainment. His first thought was of a little hand slipping into his when he walked through the front door, of school shoes kicked off by the stairs, of laughter echoing through a hallway that had nothing to do with spotlights. And in that instant, whatever version of Dean Martin the world thought it knew quietly ceased to exist. He finished rehearsal without explanation, smiling when spoken to, shaking hands, promising drinks later, stepping into the familiar rhythm of his public self as easily as a man putting on a jacket. But inside him something else was happening, something precise and deliberate. He did not go to the bar. He did not go to the casino floor. He went to his car, closed the door, and told the driver to take him home. During the ride, he made 2 phone calls, both brief, both in a voice so calm it would have unsettled anyone who knew him well. The first was to increase the security around his children's home without alarming them. The second was to cancel every engagement he had that night. There would be no performances, no appearances, no charming apologies. Something had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with a drink and a joke by the time he reached his house. The strip had already begun its transformation into spectacle. Light stacking upon light, noise building toward its nightly crescendo. But Dean stepped into a silence that felt almost sacred. He poured himself a glass of water instead of a drink, sat alone in his study, and placed the folded note on the desk in front of him. He did not tear it up. He did not burn it. He studied it the way one studies a map. Not with fear, but with attention. Because he understood something that many men in his position never did. Power that survives only on intimidation is fragile. And men who believe themselves untouchable are often standing on the thinnest ice of all. Dean Martin had spent years in the orbit of powerful people. He had seen money bend rules. He had seen influence erase consequences. He had also seen what happened to those who confused fear with loyalty. He knew this threat was not about money alone. It was about control. About reminding him that even someone who filled rooms with applause could still be reduced to a trembling father if pressed in the right place. And yet, as he sat there, listening to the clock mark each second with indifferent precision, a quiet resolve formed in him that surprised even himself. He would not respond as expected. He would not panic. He would not buy silence. And he would not allow his children to grow up in a world where a man's name could be written next to their address and treated as leverage. Later that evening, after ensuring his children were safe, after speaking to them with a softness that hid the storm moving beneath his words, Dean returned alone to his study. He took out a legal pad and began to write. Not figures, not contracts, not threats of his own, but names. Names of club owners. Names of musicians. Names of casino executives. Names of union leaders. Names of people who had, over the years, quietly complained to him about the invisible pressure that followed their success. People who had once laughed off strange requests, who had once paid small fees for smooth operations, who had once chosen comfort over confrontation. As the list grew, a realization hardened into clarity. He was not the first to be tested this way. He was simply the first whose children had been named. When the phone rang, close to midnight, Dean did not startle. He picked it up on the third ring, his voice even, almost warm. The man on the other end did not introduce himself either. He spoke as though they were continuing a conversation that had begun years earlier, referencing favors, obligations, unspoken understandings. Dean listened without interruption, letting the voice reveal its assumptions. Its confidence, its belief that this was merely another negotiation, disguised as a warning. When the man finally paused, perhaps expecting a plea or a promise, Dean spoke only one sentence in return, not loudly, not angrily, but with a calmness that carried something new inside it. "You mention reminders," he said, "but you've mistaken which of us is about to receive one." The line went silent before disconnecting. That night, Dean did not sleep. He sat by the window watching the city glow against the dark, remembering every small moment that fame had given him, and every larger moment it had nearly taken. He thought about the young singer he had once been, grateful simply to be heard. He thought about the man he had become, wealthy enough to disappear into comfort if he chose. And he thought about the children who trusted him to make the world safe. Not impressive, not glamorous, but safe. Somewhere between those thoughts, the decision completed itself. He would not handle this privately. He would not allow it to remain a shadow. If power thrived on secrecy, then the only real threat was light. As dawn approached, pale and thin over the desert horizon, Dean began making calls again. Not to gamblers or fixers, but to reporters he trusted. 2 civic leaders who owed him nothing, 2 attorneys known for their refusal to disappear inconvenient truths. He did not tell the full story yet. He did not accuse names. But he began asking questions publicly. About contracts. About backstage fees. About why certain performers were quietly removed from bills when they refused certain relationships. About why some casinos thrived, while others mysteriously collapsed. He framed it not as an attack, but as concern, as curiosity, as a desire to understand the machinery beneath the music. And even in those early hours, before headlines, before whispers, before anyone realized what he was building, something in Las Vegas shifted. Subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm, by the time the sun fully rose, casting gold across empty sidewalks and exhausted neon, Dean Martin had already taken the first steps of a path from which there would be no easy return. He knew the threat had been meant to corner him. Instead, it had clarified him. And somewhere in the stillness of that morning, while the city slept off its indulgence, he made himself a promise that did not sound heroic, did not sound cinematic, but would come to define everything that followed. No one would ever again believe they could reach his children by owning his silence. And that was the moment Las Vegas began to change. Not with an explosion, not with a headline, but with a quiet refusal inside a man the world had mistaken for only a smile. Las Vegas had always been a city of surfaces, bright lights, loud winds, public laughter. But beneath it ran a quieter economy made of favors, leverage, and invisible agreements that never appeared on contracts. Dean Martin had lived alongside that system for years without formally entering it. Understanding instinctively what many entertainers learned too late, there were doors you were invited to walk through, and doors you were only ever meant to stand near. The threat against his children, however, had forced him past the velvet rope of polite distance and into the machinery itself. And once he stepped close enough to hear it clearly, he discovered something that unsettled him more than the note ever had. The machine was not as unified as it pretended to be. It was cracked, and fear was the only thing holding its pieces together. In the days that followed that first dawn of phone calls and questions, Dean became something new in the city. Not louder, not confrontational, but strangely present. He showed up in offices he had never visited before. He requested meetings with men who were used to being deferred to, not consulted. He listened far more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he rarely accused. He asked. He framed his concern around the industry, around performers, around young singers who arrived with dreams and left with bitterness, around club owners who never quite seemed to own their own clubs. His tone disarmed people. He was Dean Martin, after all. The man who sang about love in moonlight. The man who had made them laugh on their best nights. And that familiarity loosened tongues in ways pressure never could at first. The answers were careful, vague, polished. That's just how business works. Vegas has always been complicated. Everyone makes compromises. But Dean didn't argue. He nodded. He thanked them. He left. And then, 2 days later, he returned, this time knowing something he hadn't known before. A name, a date, a contract clause, a canceled act, a performer who had vanished into smaller rooms after refusing a private arrangement. And the second conversation never sounded like the first. The pauses grew longer. The eye contact weakened. The laughter arrived too late. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the stories began to change. One club manager, a man who had once bragged to Dean about how clean his operation was, closed his office door and spoke so softly, it felt as though the walls themselves might be listening. He talked about unsigned consulting fees that weren't optional, about entertainment bookings that came with silent conditions, about the quiet understanding that certain names could not be refused without consequence. He spoke of watching men twice his size grow cautious overnight, of seeing careers stall without explanation, of knowing exactly why and pretending not to. When he finished, he didn't look relieved. He looked ashamed. Dean did not comfort him. He simply said, "You're not the only one," and left him alone with the weight of that truth. Word began to move through the strip, not in headlines. In glances, in sudden schedule changes, in invitations that arrived not to parties, but to back rooms and side offices. People began requesting time with Dean instead of the other way around. A singer who hadn't worked the main lounges in years asked for lunch. A stage technician who had spent decades watching the same faces come and go asked if he could talk off the clock. A woman who ran bookings for 3 venues brought a folder with no logo on it and hands that trembled slightly when she opened it. And every conversation added another thread to something Dean had never intended to weave, a quiet network of witnesses who had been waiting, unknowingly, for someone they trusted enough to speak to. What surprised him most was not the fear. It was the relief. Many of them spoke as though confessing something they had carried too long. They did not describe themselves as victims. They described themselves as complicit. They spoke of rationalizations, of small first concessions that grew into patterns, of how easy it was to believe there was no alternative when everyone around you was making the same choice. They spoke of how the city trained you to smile through discomfort, to call survival professionalism, to call silence loyalty. Dean listened until late evenings, his days dissolving into long rooms, heavy with unsaid years. God. And with every story, he felt the same quiet anger rise. Not violent, not reckless, but steady and resolved. This wasn't about one mobster. It never had been. It was about an architecture of intimidation that had normalized itself so completely no one remembered when it had first been built. Meanwhile, the response from the other side began to shift. At first, there had been nothing. Then subtle pressure. A sponsor delayed a contract. A booking was suddenly under review. A newspaper columnist who had always praised him wrote an oddly cool piece about aging performers losing relevance. None of it threatened him directly. That was the point. It was meant to remind him that influence did not need to announce itself to be felt. Dean recognized the strategy immediately. He had watched it applied to others. Now he was meant to feel isolated, uncertain, quietly punished until curiosity became regret. Instead, the opposite happened. Each small attempt at marginalizing him drove another person into his orbit. When a venue quietly hesitated to confirm his upcoming shows, 3 younger performers called to ask why, and ended up telling him their own stories. When a sponsor stalled, a financial backer he barely knew invited him to dinner and admitted he'd always wondered why certain deals required such strange intermediaries. When the columnist's tone shifted, a junior reporter reached out anonymously. Asking questions, Dean was no longer the only one asking. What had begun as protection for his children was becoming something else entirely. A slow exposure of the emotional economy that had governed Las Vegas, long before most of its glittering facades were built. One night, close to 2 weeks after the note, Dean received another call. Different voice. Same careful politeness. This time, the man did use a name, not his own, but Dean's. He spoke about misunderstandings, about misinterpretations, about unnecessary tension. He suggested that Dean's recent interests were drawing attention that could be uncomfortable for everyone involved. He implied there were simpler ways to resolve concern. Dean let him speak until the words ran out. Then he replied, "You're still talking as if this is private," and the silence on the line felt heavier than any threat. When the man finally asked what Dean meant, his answer was quiet but irreversible. "There are already too many people who know," he said, "and they're tired of pretending they don't." After that call, the tone of the city changed. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Certain doors closed. Others opened in places he hadn't expected. A local civic organizer asked if he would attend a small forum about performers' rights. A group of musicians' union representatives requested a conversation not about contracts, but about safety. A lawyer known for uncomfortable cases sent word that if Dean ever wanted formal channels, they were available. It was not a mobilization yet. There were no marches, no headlines, no confrontations, but there was alignment. An alignment Dean knew was what power feared most. Late one evening, alone again in his study, Dean spread the notes he had taken across his desk: names, stories, dates, patterns. He realized that what he had been collecting was not ammunition. It was testimony. And testimony carried a different kind of force. It didn't shatter windows. It changed narratives. It redefined what was acceptable to ignore. And as he looked at the growing map of quiet suffering that now intersected through him, the weight of it pressed into his chest more heavily than any threat ever had. He had not sought this. He had not planned it. He had only refused to be cornered. But now, whether he wanted it or not, people were watching to see if he would stop. The following morning, he stood on the balcony of his home and watched the city wake. Delivery trucks, early workers, the last of the night crowd drifting away. Las Vegas did not look powerful in that hour. It looked human. And in that fragile, ordinary light, Dean understood something with absolute clarity. The man who had named his children had believed fear would keep him manageable. Instead, it had clarified him. And clarity, once shared, was contagious. He picked up the phone and made a call he had delayed until that moment. Not to a reporter, not to an executive, but to someone who had once organized a public forum for entertainers who had been quietly pushed aside years earlier. When the voice answered, Dean said only, I think it's time people spoke where others can hear them." There was a pause, then a breath, then a reply that carried both disbelief and something like hope. "We've been waiting for someone like you to say that," the voice said. Dean ended the call and remained standing there, the morning air cool against his face, knowing that what came next would no longer be confined to offices and whispered rooms. The Strip thrived on spectacle. If change was going to reach it, it would have to survive the light, and somewhere not far away. In places built to command obedience, men were beginning to realize that something they had always controlled through silence was starting to move without their permission. Las Vegas had witnessed every kind of spectacle imaginable. It had watched fortunes collapse at green tables and rise again before sunrise. It had applauded illusions, scandals, comebacks, and carefully manufactured legends. But it had never quite known what to do when a man it loved refused to perform. And that, more than any announcement, was what made the night begin to feel different long before anyone could explain why. Dean. Martin was scheduled to take the stage at one of the Sand's most anticipated midweek shows. A room packed not only with tourists, but with executives, journalists, performers, and investors who understood the quiet meaning of who attended whose tables. Tickets had sold out in hours. Rumors had already begun moving through back corridors and valet lines that Dean had been asking. Questions that he had become interested in industry matters, that something was stirring beneath the polished routines. The house expected an evening of warmth, laughter, familiar music. A reminder that Las Vegas still knew how to make the world forget itself. What it received instead was silence. When the orchestra finished its opening number and the announcer delivered Dean's introduction with practiced flourish, the lights rose and he walked out alone, without the casual wave, without the loose smile that usually arrived before the applause even finished. The clapping continued, uncertain at first, then stronger, and gradually thinning as people noticed he had not moved toward the microphone. He stood still, one hand resting lightly on the stand, eyes traveling the room as if he were memorizing it. The applause finally faded into a murmur. Somewhere a glass chimed against another. Somewhere a laugh died unfinished. Dean leaned slightly forward and spoke not as a singer, not as a host, but as a man addressing other people directly. He did not open with humor. He did not sing. He thanked the orchestra and asked them to step back. The musicians exchanged glances, unused to instructions that interrupted the ritual, but they complied. The stage lights softened, and suddenly the great room felt smaller, more intimate, as though the Strip itself had leaned closer. "I've spent most of my life," Dean began, "making rooms lighter. Tonight, I'm going to make one heavier." The words moved through the audience with a soft ripple of surprise. He spoke calmly, deliberately, not accusing, not dramatic, but unmistakably serious. He talked about the young performers who arrived in Las Vegas believing success was only about talent and discipline. He talked about club owners who discovered that certain agreements were expected but never written. He talked about careers that slowed without explanation, contracts that dissolved without cause, people who learned to smile while being quietly cornered. He framed none of it as rumor. He framed it as experience, as conversations, as patterns that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Then he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice lowered just enough that the audience leaned in. 2 weeks ago," he said, "someone decided to remind me how this city sometimes protects its arrangements." He did not mention his children. He did not reveal the note. He did not need to. The implication alone sent a visible change through the crowd. People straightened. Executives stopped whispering. A few familiar faces near the front grew very still. "I was offered a choice," Dean continued, "silence or consequence. And I realized something in that moment. We've all been offered that choice, over and over. Some of us accepted it because we were afraid, some because we were tired, some because it was easier to believe nothing could change. Tonight I'm choosing something else." The room held its breath. Dean did not raise his voice. He did not call out any names. He did something far more unsettling. He invited people to stand. not performers, not staff, people, anyone who had ever felt pressured into an agreement they couldn't defend, anyone who had ever been warned without being threatened, anyone who had ever watched someone else's career dim because they said no. You don't have to speak, he said. You don't have to explain. Just stand. For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. And then, near the back, someone rose. Slowly, a woman. Then another. A man near the side aisle. Then two more. The movement spread not like a wave, but like a realization, table by table, section by section. Within seconds, dozens of people were on their feet. Not dramatically, not defiantly, quietly, the orchestra pit, the side seating, even parts of the reserved front rows. And with every person who stood, the room changed from an audience into a mirror. Dean did not comment. He simply nodded once, the smallest acknowledgement, and let the image speak. Journalists in attendance were already writing. Ushers had stopped moving. Conversations across the casino floor outside slowed as word filtered outward that something unprecedented was happening inside. Not a protest. Not a performance. A public accounting. Then Dean said the words that would later be quoted in headlines, debated in boardrooms and whispered by performers for years. Power doesn't survive exposure, he said. It survives belief. And belief doesn't hold up well in the light. He thanked those who had stood. He asked them to sit. He told the room that within the next week there would be open forums, legal channels, independent reviews, and public conversations about how entertainment in Las Vegas truly worked. He did not promise outcomes. He promised process. If this city is going to sell dreams, he said, it has to stop trading in fear. The applause that followed was not the roaring kind that followed a hit song. It was uneven, emotional. Some clapped slowly. Some stood again. Some did neither and simply watched, unsettled. As if they had just witnessed something that did not fit anywhere they could comfortably place it. Dean did not return to the microphone. He did not sing. He thanked the orchestra once more and walked off stage. Outside, the strip felt different. Not quieter. More alert. Reporters rushed to phones. Managers closed office doors. Performers gathered in small clusters, speaking in low, urgent voices. A few executives left quickly. Others stayed as though unwilling to move first, and in places built on the assumption that nothing truly threatened the system. Men sat in rooms where no one was smiling. Within hours, local papers were printing early editions. By morning, national outlets were calling it the night Las Vegas was forced to listen. Stories emerged. Some cautious, some bold, some anonymous. Then less so. A booking assistant admitted on record that she had been instructed to reroute contracts through intermediaries. A singer described being warned that refusal would make her difficult. A former lounge manager spoke of backroom expectations he had been told were tradition. None of them accused any single figure. They didn't have to. The architecture was becoming visible. Dean spent that night at home, not celebrating, not sleeping, sitting quietly while the phone rang and rang again. Some calls were grateful. Some were frightened. Some were angry. A few were wordless, hanging up as soon as he answered. He listened. He took notes. He told his children stories and made them laugh, and then sat alone again when they were asleep. Because beneath the sense of movement, beneath the emerging solidarity, there was something else now pressing against the edges of the city. Exposure unsettled those who thrived in shadow. An unsettled power often tried to reassert itself. Near dawn, a call came that did not bother to disguise its tone. It did not threaten, it warned. It spoke of consequences that followed men who confused popularity with protection. It suggested that Dean had miscalculated the difference between being loved and being safe. When the voice finished, Dean replied in the same calm register he had learned to trust. "I am safe," he said, "because I am not alone anymore." The line went dead as light crept over the desert and touched the strip's tired signs. Dean stood by the window again as he had weeks earlier. But this time, he was not watching in solitude. He could feel the city's attention like a current. He knew what he had done could not be undone. He had taken something that had lived comfortably in whispers and made it visible. And visibility had a momentum of its own. Las Vegas would not change in a night. He knew that. No system built over decades collapses because one man refused to sing. But systems did not survive either when enough people stopped pretending they were natural. That night had given people something more dangerous than anger. It had given them recognition, and recognition once shared could no longer be folded back into a note and placed quietly on a desk. Change never arrives the way people imagine. It does not crash through doors. It does not announce itself in clean victories. It seeps. It unsettles. It lingers in conversations that refuse to fade. In the weeks after the night, Dean Martin walked onto a stage and declined to perform. Las Vegas did not erupt into chaos or reform. It hesitated. And for a city built on momentum, hesitation was the first real fracture. The Strip continued to glow. Shows continued to sell out. Dice continued to roll. But beneath that continuity, something unfamiliar was happening. Meetings stretched longer than they used to. Contracts were reviewed instead of rubber-stamped. Managers hesitated before making the quiet calls that once solved inconvenient problems. Performers who had lived with an unspoken ceiling above their ambitions began, carefully at first, to speak to one another instead of only to their superiors. The city had not changed its face. It had changed its posture. The forums Dean had mentioned on stage began as small gatherings in hotel, conference rooms, and union halls. Folding chairs, coffee urns, notepads. No banners, no slogans. Just people who had never been invited into the same room discovering how similar their private experiences sounded out loud. A booking assistant sat beside a headliner. A retired stagehand spoke after a young singer. Casino staff listened to musicians. Some spoke shakily, some angrily, some with a relief that trembled into tears. Attorneys attended, not as authorities, but as record keepers. Journalists observed, not to sensationalize, but to understand. And Dean, when he attended, rarely spoke at all. He sat in the second or third row, listening, his presence a quiet signal that this was not a temporary moment of interest. It was a process. With each forum, the map of the city's hidden economy became clearer. Not a conspiracy of a single figure, but a culture of leverage that had grown so familiar it was often mistaken for professionalism. Expectations that had never been voted on, conditions that had never been published, warnings that had never been written. The system's power had always rested on isolation, on making each person believe their discomfort was singular. The rooms were proving otherwise. As attention grew, formal responses followed. Casinos announced independent reviews. Entertainment boards released statements promising structural reassessment. Agencies spoke publicly about performer protections that had existed mostly as marketing language before. None of it was perfect. None of it was immediate. But none of it would have happened at all without exposure. And exposure had begun with a man who refused to negotiate his children's safety in silence. The pressure, of course, did not vanish. It adapted. There were whispers that Dean had become difficult. Suggestions that he was politicizing entertainment. Invitations that never arrived. Calls that were not returned. But there were also new invitations. To civic discussions, 2 educational panels, 2 closed-door meetings with city leaders who realized the economic health of Las Vegas was inseparable from the trust of those who powered it. Dean was not interested in titles. He declined most of them. He cared only that the conversations continued, whether or not his name was attached. One afternoon, months after that night, Dean was invited to attend a closed session with a group of younger performers. They were not famous yet. Some had only just arrived in the city. They spoke not about fear, but about the difference they felt in the air. How contracts now came with explanations. How certain expectations were being put in writing. How they were encouraged, for the first time, to consult independent advisors without being treated as ungrateful. It was not a revolution. It was a shift, and shifts Dean knew were what lasted. After the session, one young man lingered. He looked no older than Dean had been when he first realized his voice could fill rooms. He hesitated, then asked a question that did not sound rehearsed. "Did you know," he said, "that it would get this big?" Dean studied him for a moment, then shook his head. "I knew it couldn't stay small," he replied. "When something is wrong long enough, it only needs a place to stand before it starts walking on its own." That evening, Dean drove home without an escort. He had reduced the security around his children, not because the world had become harmless, but because he refused to teach them that fear was a permanent state. He wanted them to understand caution, not captivity. He cooked dinner. He listened to stories about school. He laughed at a joke that made no sense, and laughed anyway. And as he sat at the table, watching them reach for bread and talk over one another, the weight he had carried for months finally softened into something like peace. Not because the threat had vanished, but because its power had. Later, alone again in his study, Dean took out the original note. He had kept it not as evidence, but as a reminder. He read the single sentence once more. Men who forget their obligations often need reminders of what truly matters. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer, not because he feared it, but because he no longer needed to see it to remember what it had taught him. Obligation was not something imposed. It was something chosen, and he had chosen. Las Vegas did not build statues for what he did. There were no grand ceremonies, no official declarations that the city had been changed forever, but there were other signs, subtler, more durable. A performers' council formed that operated independently of venue ownership. A confidential reporting structure was implemented across several major casinos. Contracts were standardized. Third-party advocates became common where once they had been discouraged. The next generation of entertainers arrived into a city that still glittered, still tempted, still tested them, but no longer quite as comfortably hidden. Years later, when interviews referenced that period, people would often ask Dean why he had risked his standing, his comfort, his position. He always gave them the answer they didn't expect. He never spoke first about courage, or legacy, or justice. He spoke about kitchens, about school shoes by the door, about the sound of his children laughing in rooms that had nothing to do with stages. Some things, he would say, teach you exactly who you are responsible for. After that, the rest is just consistency. Perhaps that was what Las Vegas ultimately learned. That its legends were not defined by how brightly they shone under lights, but by what they refused to trade when no one was watching. That a city could survive illusion, but it could not outlast the quiet decisions of people who stopped believing illusion was all it deserved. The mobster who had believed fear could be delivered like a message had miscalculated the nature of the man he targeted. He had assumed Dean Martin was a performer first. He had forgotten that before anything else, he was a father. And fathers, when they decide to stand, do not look for applause. They change the ground.